He was cutting the ring off. He was in his face. He was on his chest.
Yeah.
And of course, Sykes just didn't know what to do with him.
That's it. To keep him off, if you're not going to grab and hold, it means you've got to be throwing punches all the time.
Yeah.
And that's tiring you all the time, especially if they're not landing. But when I was boxing, I always found the worst type of opponents you can box really are pressure fighters, because they're always in front of you, and you don't have a second to have any rest from them.
Yeah.
You know, and some people like John L. Garner are very good at it. And I mean, it took a future world champion to stop John L. Gardner, Michael Dokes.
Mm-hmm.
Michael Dokes was a very special talent indeed. And after he stopped John L. Gardner, he went on to win the world heavyweight title. I think it was a WBA version.
Yeah, I mean, John L. Gardner said to me, he said, I took that fight because I'd never heard of him. He said, in the first round, I realised why they called him Michael TNT Dokes.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that fight, I don't know if you ever watched it.
Yeah, I have, yeah.
It's a ferocious fight. That. I mean, John, and then I think John had a rest after that, and then he
come back to Noel Quares.
And he wasn't the same fighter. He wasn't the same fighter by that time, John.
Yeah, well, John said to me, he said, if you look at that fight, he said, I've been retired for a bit, and he said, I have blonde hair, I have a suntan. He said, I'd been on a beach in Tenerife, I hadn't done any, and you know, his ex-wife made him do it. But a couple of more questions, Kevin, before I let you go. Obviously now, Sykes been and gone, he's going to be, there's films, there's going to be documentaries. I mean, I'd certainly like to put you forward for a documentary, Kevin. But how do you, before I ask you about the film, how do you remember Paul Sykes, and how do you think he should his legacy be remembered as the daddy of a dozen prison yards, or was he a guy who was misunderstood? Was he a thug? You tell me.
Well, he was many things, wasn't he? Throughout his life. He's probably a person with many different personalities as well.
Do you think he was mentally ill?
No, when I knew him, when he was doing the boxing, I don't think he was mentally ill. But I don't think his upbringing helped.
Yeah,
you know,
he was damaged
because he had no guidance from his parents, his father, and he had no guidance. So
his mother was just as bad. She was like a man, she, size 9 feet, and she gives Paul a lot of beatings. I've spoke to his only sibling. It's. I think he never really recovered. He was still that broken little boy in a man's body, and obviously he spent the years 17 to 30. So he'd never kind of dated girls, and that was the reason. He said, when I got out at 30, he said I was still a 15-year-old boy, and that's why I found 15-year-old girls attractive. Of course, back then it was, you'd got a pat on the back if you were dating a 15 or 16-year-old, where these days you're a paedophile. But it was very different in the late 70s. I'm not making excuses.
Very different.
Yeah, it was.
They used to buy... They used to have magazines. There's no internet in them days. They used to have magazines like Playboy magazines or whatever, and you'd have models dressed up as schoolgirls.
Yeah.
And those were on open sale in newsagents. It was different in those days. But coming back to Paul's upbringing, he would have had very low self-esteem, and it's not surprising his decision making was poor. I mean, so obviously he became violent on impulse, whereas most people they'll think first, won't they? They'll think, well,
yeah. Do you know what he lacked? He lacked the social skills. Yeah. He couldn't adapt to someone saying, "Oh, F off" or something. It was a bang, a right answer straight away. Where me and you, we have life skills to interact and learn to walk away and think, hang on a minute, if I knock him out, I'm getting arrested, and I'm getting, these things all play in our heads, where Sykes...
Yeah. Because I think once he was even arrested on the afternoon of a fight.
Really?
He had a boxing match that night. I think they stopped at a service station or something, and he got into a fight with a professional wrestler, and he ended up getting arrested. And I mean, whereas most people, they think, well, look, I'm boxing tonight, I'm going to get paid.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people, they don't know, but professional boxers, they're not on a weekly wage, they get paid when they have a fight. And whereas most people, they would think ahead about the consequences. But he had a brutal upbringing, and I think that had a lot to do with
Did you know, I spoke to another gentleman from Manchester, and I forgot his name, but I think you knew him. And you know, he said, I had to tell Paul, he said, oh, there's Neil Malpass. And this was a day or two before the fight. He said, I'm going to follow him to the toilets and go and batter him. He said, Paul, you can't. He said, hang on. He said, you're boxing in 2 days. He said, and he couldn't quite grasp. Every day was a fight day for Paul Sykes, and you know, he didn't have that. Hang on a minute. I mean, you know, John L. Gardner got a lot. I mean, Paul Sykes got $17.50 for the John L. Gardner fight, and John couldn't believe it. He said, I was on so much, but Paul just took it, and he said, I won that, but it's just a fight. You know, probably got the short end of the stick, but
it sounds like it. Because a year later he was getting paid £10,000, although the fight was overseas. He would have realised then that he would have known anyway at the time, Paul, that he was getting ripped off. Because he was well connected. He knew people, and they also knew people and everything. But it makes me laugh when I hear people say that they said this and they said that to Paul when he was in his prime. It's just a figment of their imagination, because they would have got flattened mid-sentence. You know, he wouldn't have had anybody walking up to him and them giving him a piece of their... He would have flattened them, you know. So I can't see that happening. And also, I noticed at the gym everybody called him Paul. I never heard anybody call him Sykes. So, you know, everybody called him Paul.
What makes me laugh is people saying, Lenny McLean would have beaten. Now, Lenny McLean was beaten 6 times, knocked out 5 times, and kinda, in the greatest respect, beaten by pub fighters. You know, obviously Paul Sykes had fought for the British, and I asked John L. Gardner this, and I asked Neil Malpass, and John L. Gardner absolutely detested Paul Sykes. He really did. He said, listen, he said it'd have been 1 round. He said Sykes would have walked through him, and Neil Malpass just laughed. You know, there's levels. There's levels, and you know, Lenny McLean may have been a monster on the cobbles, but under the Queensberry rules, it's a totally different thing. It's like football and rugby. You're both playing with a ball. Listen, Sykes would have absolutely annihilated him.
Well, he would have done that. There were people. I think somebody called Kevin Paddock. He was.
Funny you should say that, because Sykes was going to fight McLean. And basically, Sykes had fought Terry Mitchell, got a canceller. So Kevin Paddock was really a blown-up middleweight from Leicester, I think. And basically, he was the replacement from Sykes, and he outboxed Lenny McLean for 8 rounds. Lenny said the reason this display was so poor was the change of opponent. So if a blown up fat middleweight like Kevin Paddock would have beaten Lenny McLean with ease, what would a big, horrible, ugly, grisly monster of a heavyweight like Paul Sykes would have done? I think it's, you know, it's an easy question. But Kevin, what do you think on the Paul Sykes film happening, the documentary? It's going to become, he's going to become very famous in the next couple of years. Did you see it coming? I mean, can you understand the interest in such this unbelievable, unique, one-off character? You know, because a lot of people get really annoyed with me, you shouldn't be doing these films, and, you know, you're glorifying these things, but you knew him, I didn't. Can you understand the interest the public have?
Yeah, of course I can. Yeah. Firstly, he put Wakefield on the map. Yeah. Before Paul Sykes, I'd only heard of Wakefield because they've got a rugby club, Wakefield Trinity.
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about Wakefield, and then I heard Paul was from there, and then you know, and like I say, he was a top sportsman at his time, and his later life, although it was very sad, I believe he'd done some bad things throughout his life, but yes.
I mean, if you'd have...
He lived a full life, and he lived an interesting life, so yeah, I can understand why making a film about him.
Because he was always very nice to you, wasn't he? For some reason.
Yeah, he was okay with me, yeah. So, like I said, that first night, I didn't know who he was, I just got talking to him about football and everything, and then he watched me spar, and we got on okay after that, yeah.
And if you'd have known about his decline in 2000, certainly from 2002, it was as bad as you can get. So he had 5 years, and listen, if he'd done any wrong in life, what he got, there's a saying, I've told you a million times, stop exaggerating. I'm not exaggerating. If he'd done any wrong in his life, God paid him back 1,000 times. Would you have drove over to Wakefield and bought him a dinner? Did you think, would it have saddened you, or would you have reached out to him?
Yes, of course I would. I would have tried. But like I say, it would by that time, whether or not he would remember me or not.
Yeah, he wouldn't have done. He didn't hardly remember anyone, even like family members at the end. But what I think another tragedy of Paul was with the Paul Sykes story. So he died in March the 7th, 2007. YouTube came along November the 30th, 2006. So YouTube came along 3 or 4 months. But if people would have known who this guy used to be, you'd have had if that would have been a little bit earlier, you'd have had kids all going to Wakefield for selfies and videos, and listen, I wouldn't have got near him because Ricky Gervais,
he would have been a hero.
Bob Mortimer, Jamie Carragher, Robbie Williams, all obsessed with Paul. I mean, I've had conversations with Martin O'Neill. I've had conversations with some proper stars, and they're all. I mean, Ricky Gervais has based comedies on Paul Sykes. Robbie Williams said it's the best thing I've ever seen. He said some of the best nights I've had in my life are eating crisp sandwiches, watching Paul Sykes at Large. That's what he told the filmmakers, Paul Sykes at Large. The guy who discovered Paul Sykes was a guy called Fred Dinage.
Yeah.
And he's the guy who interviews him in '78 when he's saying, that's your first fight, what's next? And he said, Rosa Flats, Joe Bugner, 7. So that's Fred Dinage. But he got to the point where he couldn't deal with Sykes anymore, so he passed him over to Nick Lord and a guy called Roger Greenwood in the mid-'80s. And that's when the film was made, and obviously Paul Sykes at Large was released December the 4th, 1990. The greatest documentary I've ever seen. That is up there on its own and I often watch it now, still to this day. The wife says to me, don't you get sick of watching that? I've watched it easily, Kevin, over 100 times.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I owe Paul Sykes a lot. Because 10 years ago next month, someone said to me, watch Paul Sykes at Large. I've never heard of it, so I watched the documentary. then I read the book, Sweet Agony, and then I walked in the story. I met all the characters, your Delroy Showers, your Paul's sisters. I've been to stay with Paul's wife. So many different things. I've been into prison to see his sons. So Delroy Showers, the Spenceleys. So I've walked into the book, I've walked into the documentary, and it's basically given me a career. And I've done now 20 odd books. But if I'd never watched Paul Sykes at Large, if I'd never read Sweet Agony, I'd still be working on a building site, or I'd be in security, or I'd be just, I don't know. But that's purely because I got obsessed with Paul Sykes.
Yeah.
I obsessed over him for 3 years, and I thought, you know what? Hold my coat, hold my pint. And I walked into the city of Wakefield. Yes, I've pissed a lot of people off. You know, a lot of people don't like me because I've dug the ghost of Paul Sykes up. He'd been forgot about by that point, and now there's films, there's so many different things. You know, yes, I'm aware, Kevin, there's victims out there, and I've met victims. I've met people who cried in front of me because he'd done this and that and the other. But I've also met people who cried in front of me for a different reason, and they miss him, and he was different, and I don't know. I could go on and on and on. But he's a character. It's just I've never researched any. I mean, obviously, I've researched a lot of characters. Roy Shaws, Lee Duffy's, all these bad people. I'm doing Junior Witter's book next. But do you know what? I mean, Sykes, he's just someone that you just think, wow, like, hang on, stop, and you're like, right, and you just want to know more. And it was, to be honest, I had probably borderline unhealthy obsession. I really did. But do you know? But now people are realising he's not just that crazy guy on YouTube that's had millions of views who's talking about punching sharks. There's a deeper layers to his story, and he was a boxer, he was a poet, he was an author, he was a good rugby player. He was an abused child.
He was a fully qualified football referee as well.
Do you know, he had A levels, he had O levels, he had a degree. But he was. Do you know something? And I often say and it's not hearsay because I have Googled and I've seen some of his personal belongings from his sister. He had an education, right? School teachers couldn't hold a torch to, but he had a bigger qualification in violence, and he just couldn't. He wasn't blessed with patience, and he just couldn't. You know, every single day he couldn't sleep unless he punched someone. This far outweighed all in positive things, and. I spoke to someone who was very close to him years ago, and he said, in Paul's brain was 1,000 different departments, and everyone is evil. Everyone was thinking of doing bad things, and listen, I didn't know him. You did, I didn't. But what I have done, I've dug deep and I've researched so many different levels of victims. Prison. I spoke to the top chief of Wakefield Police, West Yorkshire Police. People have been in prison with him. Just so many different things, and I never get tired of listening and learning, because I like to study the psychology. What made him like that? Why was he like that?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, coming back to when I knew him as when he was boxing, his boxing days, and then I saw him in the documentary. He was like two different people.
Was it really?
Oh yeah, it was.
So by then, by then, it was
10 years.
But let me think. So that documentary was filmed from 88 to 90, and it was released. It was released December the 4th. So what you're seeing on there, so you've never seen him from 79. So what you've seen on there is 10, 11 years on.
Completely different person. Not just physically as well as mentally. It's like a different personality. And when he's in the television documentary, he seems drunk a lot of the time, because it's not the Paul Sykes I knew 10 years previous.
Yeah, he was drunk. The filmmaker said to me, I mean, the filmmakers actually hit them. And he hit them a couple of times, but it was always to the belly. It was not, so. But he would drink, particularly that time. As you see when he's interviewing with filming of Dennis Flint, that was the day. So that was September the 12th, 1989, and he'd only been there a couple of minutes, and he's like, "Get us a drink." So that was, Sykes the drinker kind of happened in the 80s. That's when he started smoking. When he was in Durham prison before he was a pro, the whole prison, the whole wing couldn't smoke in case he breathed it. So obviously back then, it wasn't just the drink and the fags. Then he was into the drugs. That never really gets spoken of, but he was into amphetamines quite a lot. He tried heroin. He wouldn't do it on the foil, but he'd roll up in cigarettes. So the drugs was as much of a problem with the drink. So he was basically doing everything he shouldn't have, Kevin, by that point.
Yeah, and also if he said something, he thought it was right all the time. It wouldn't be wise to disagree with him. Otherwise, there could be a problem. There could be a problem.
Yeah.
There could be a problem if you disagreed with him.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you a story.
Because it was better to. It's like when he turned up in the white Rolls Royce and he asked me, did I like his car? I said, yeah. There's no way I would. Normally, I would say where did you get it from, or where did it come from? But
well, do you know? Paul Sykes had a really bad scar. It happened about 1991, just after the documentary. So basically, Paul was in his sister's home, having a couple of pints with her husband. So this guy's called David. So Paul's basically then started slagging his brother off. Really bad, ripping into him, tearing strips off. And just because David, Paul's brother-in-law, didn't agree with him, Paul then lunged up and punched him all over the front room, just because he didn't agree with him. And then, if you watch Paul Sykes at large, you'll notice a little cat behind Paul's mum. Now, Kay, Paul's sister, picked that up and hit Paul in the face with it. A lot of people, if you look at Paul's later pictures, I'll send you one or two afterwards, he has this great scar across the cheek. It looks like he's been like a Stanley knife, like a Chelsea or a Millwall. And so that was from his sister. And when his sister done that, Paul stood, give her a round of applause and said, "You've got the Sykes fighting spirit." But that was just, they were having a great night, and just because he didn't agree with him that his brother was this arsehole, it was just extreme violence. And Delroy Showers said to me, he said often we'd be out in a pub having a great time, the music could be on, it'd be a lovely summer's night, and we'd only been there a couple of minutes and everyone's such on a high, and all of a sudden Paul's turned up and all you've just heard is bang, and then you've heard another bang, this man's hit the floor, and then Delroy has thought, the police are coming, the ambulances are coming, we've got to get out. So he just didn't have this, he never thought the repercussions of his actions. It wasn't even a thought, it was bang. Do you know what I mean? And as you said, he was a bear. He was he had the pugilistic skills. He had this ridiculous strength. I spoke to one guy who was in Durham prison with him, and he said, "You know what, Jamie?" He said, "I seen him lift weights that people at the Olympics were getting gold medals for." He said he was a freak. He was phenomenal. But that's what makes him so interesting.
Yeah. Just before the Gardner fight, Ken, the trainer, he was training Paul so he could do a 1-to-1. It was one of the final workouts. I think we were just doing pad work and whatever. And these four guys come walking into the gym, and one of them was a giant like Paul, and he insisted he wanted to spar with Paul. And Ken, the trainer, said to him, no way, because this is, this guy's fighting for the British, and Commonwealth heavyweight titles in a few days' time. There's no way you can spar with him. Anyway, this big guy, who was about as big as Paul, he insisted on sparring with Paul. So eventually Paul became a bit agitated and says, just put the fucking gloves on, Ken, you know? So anyway, he got him gloved up, and when the bell went for the first round, Paul went straight over, hit him with a right hand, and this guy, he was not clean out, and his head was resting on the ring apron. He was unconscious. Ken didn't know what to do, but luckily, in the corner of the gym, there's a kitchenette, and it had a landline telephone number in it. And from there, he phoned an ambulance, and about 10 minutes later, the ambulance turns up with two guys. They weren't paramedics in them days, they were just like, probably knew a bit about first aid.
Yeah.
And they put this guy away on a stretcher. So that was like I said, there was always something happening with him.
Yeah, that's what John Spencer said. There was always someone. He said if someone wasn't getting knocked out, he said someone was getting humiliated, or you know, someone was. Sorry. If you've been out in public with him, you'd be on edge. Yeah.
I'd have been a nervous wreck.
Yeah.
Because if somebody looks at him the wrong way, it's gonna.
Did you know? I mean, John used to avoid him sometimes, and it wasn't because he didn't like Paul. John Spencer in Middlesbrough is a very well-known, highly successful businessman. He's become a millionaire and all this thing. But he's from a council estate, John. You know, so he got Paul. He'd done a little time in prison. But John said to me, he said I had to hide him because I had really high class businessmen who, if I'd have had them in Paul's company, he said I wouldn't know where to look. He said they didn't realise Paul Sykes was he wasn't a normal man. He was a dangerous bastard. He was something that you will never see in your life ever again. He wasn't a normal person. He was a highly, extremely violent, disturbed, functioning psychotic psychopath. He was, you know, and he would have done some terrible things in the blink of an eye that were normal to him. So, you know, that was the reason why he said I always tried to keep him at distance, and there'd always just be me and him, or his brother who knew him. You know, some of the tales he told me, he got out and he went and moved him with Tony Spencer for 6 months, but he was still institutionalised. He was still, you know, he couldn't quite realise he could go to the toilet when he wanted, and Tony's kids were noisy when he was up, and you know, he was getting agitated, but he was good with kids because he was still a kid himself. He used to do this thing with his arm where it used to, and his muscle pop up, and his kids would say, "Oh," and they'd try and do it, you know, and he was kind of still this little boy in this big monster's body.
He was. I mean, I never saw him kick off anywhere, but I don't know how they would stop him when he was in his prime. I mean, I think the taser guns were invented 50 years too late. Yeah, because they would have needed some of them to deal with him, you know. Because
I mean, John Spencer describes him. He said, "Do you know what? He come around in a wrong generation. He should have been around when they fought lions for entertainment, or he should have been around in the Wild West, you know, when there was bar fights. He was just in the wrong era." And that was Paul's. What was normal in Paul's head really wasn't normal.
No, he's by far the hardest man I've ever come across, and there isn't even a close second.
That's what Clive Broughton said, who'd done several prisons. You know, he said I was in prison one day, and he said the word got round that Sykes had just arrived in Durham prison. And I'm not going to name them, but there's a couple of well-known families in the northeast, and they just got up, walked back in the cell and closed the door because Sykes had just turned up. He was just a complete freak of nature, and then that's what he said there was no one close to him.
No, somebody asked me once just how hard was he, and I said, well, let's put it this way, if you were in a fight you wouldn't want him on the other side.
Yeah.
And they're now making a movie about him, and
Well, I'll give you the last word to you, Kevin. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. We'll stay in touch. I believe you're going to be writing a book yourself. Yeah. But so we'll stay in touch, mate. Obviously, I'd like to put you forward for the documentary. So there's going to be a film. And a documentary which kind of run along this, a bit like Lenny McLean, but hopefully it's going to be a lot better than that. Obviously Paul Sykes it's starting to hit the newspapers now. I was in the Daily Star Monday. The Wakefield Express are reporting next week. But there's a lot of things I can't announce yet because Western Edge Pictures, they've signed the contract and they've basically killed me. But it will be really big news when it happens. But to leave you, Kevin, I'll give you the last word to you, sir.
Well, good luck with the film, and.
It was certainly an experience to be around Mr. Sykes, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, unforgettable, and it was certainly a character that I'll never forget. And in the world of boxing, it's like you were saying before, there just aren't them kind of characters around anymore.
Do you know, there's a lot of people over the years I've met, and I've met a lot of people now. As I said, I've done over 20 books. I mean, there was 50 in the first one. So I've met a lot of people from all the different walks of life. And what I find is, even if you met Paul Sykes once, it was a bit like meeting the Loch Ness Monster or the Abominable Snowman. Or it was like people still remember where they were and how it was and kind of thing. And it's
it's true that
unforgettable.
Like I was saying before, my very first night at the professional boxing gym, he was really like the first person I spoke to. He was there getting changed in the changing room, so there was only him there, so I got talking to him, got to know him, and when I was at the professional boxing gym, it was good to meet there, and remember him as a good guy.
Yeah, that's interesting because it doesn't always get said that, and most people I find who have an opinion, he was this and he was that, and they're like, well, did you meet him? And people will go, well, did you meet him? I'm like, well, no, never, and I never said I did, but I like to get the good, bad and the ugly, and there was a good side to him. Albeit, I mean, this day and age, I believe he would have had everything, he would have been diagnosed with everything, but life and society and a way of living back then, if you had mental health issues, it was like, oh, shut up you puff, pull yourself together and all that.
It was completely different.
Yeah.
It was completely different in those days. I mean, if there was a bereavement or something, there was no counselling in those days. You were told to just pull yourself together, get a few pints down you, and you'll be all right. Pull yourself together, sort of man up. No matter what happened, no matter how bad it was, you were told, pull yourself together, and completely different in them days. And I mean, like nowadays, I think it would have been sectioned, wouldn't it?
Well, do you know what? I'll tell you a fact. Now, I know, right, Paul Sykes was in all these various different prisons, hospitals. Now, he had I spoke about this to the Sykes family and, his sister. And he had all the tests on him in the world. And it always come back, he was bad rather than mad. But I don't believe that. He's been gone just over 15 years now. He clearly wasn't normal. And I think society. Even from the time I sat at length with his sister 7 years ago, the technology and the science and certainly the medical health thing has grown so much in the last 7 years, that, you know, I spoke to one guy, Gavin Hepworth, and he was in America training the dogs, FBI and all this, and a Texas lawman or something watched Paul Sykes, and he come up with, I can't remember his name, it may be in the book, and he said, "Do you know what?" He said, "This guy here is a genius and a psychopath in equal measures." And that was someone who had letters after his name and all this, and that's what I believe. You know, there's no way in the world that man was sane. And I think if they had done the tests on Paul Sykes in 2022, like they did in the 80s, and all these different prisons and where he was shipped to, and all these tests, and they were giving him Lagactyl and all these different medication things and examining him, I think it'd have been like mad as a box of frogs, you know. And I don't mean it in a bad way. To quote his sister, she said to me, exact words, she said, "I would have loved a normal brother who went to work 7 a.m. and come home at 5. He said, "I just didn't have that. I had this oddball. I had this violent oddball." And she said he wasn't right from start to finish. That were her exact words. So, you know, I think maybe rather than society let him down, I think God let him down by putting him in the wrong generation. I think he was born. He was born in 46. I think if he'd have come along 50 years later, he'd have been put on the medication Ronnie Cray was. Stemitol, you know. Apparently, I mean, I've met people close to Ronnie Cray, Chris Lambian, and so some days he was normal when he was on his medication. He was sedated, and on other days when he hadn't, he was making his list of people to kill. And I think that was very much like Paul Sykes. I definitely, you know, in all the research I'd done, I just, you know, rather than, you know, I think he should have been looked after, and at the end of his life he was sectioned, and Wakefield Council did put him into I can't remember the name, it's in the book, but they did kind of look after him more. Roy Summit, is it?
I
can't remember, but they give him a carer, they put him in a home, he was on certain allowance, you know, and but could you have done that with, you know, at the end of his life was very easy, because a gush of wind would have blew him over. He was ravaged with
it's really sad.
He was ravaged with arthritis. He had what was the thing, the sugar thing, diabetes, pretty bad. I mean, his hands were that knackered he couldn't open a can of beer, so he was easy to deal with for the last 5 years, maybe 7 years. But could you have told Paul Sykes when he was 30 to, let me think, so he died when he was 60.
60, yeah.
So it would have been hard to tell Paul Sykes up to the age of 52, 53, right, you're not doing that, and you're going to go in. So I don't know. I think it would have been really, really hard. But he was born in the wrong era. John Spencer said, and for a fighting sense, he should have been in the Cowboys and the saloons picking girls up. But also, if he'd have been around now, he could have had the medication, and that would have maybe saved him and saved a lot of others from violent assaults and this, that and the other. But
he would have got the help, but whether or not he would have accepted it is another issue, because he always thought he was in the right.
Yeah.
Always. Mm-hmm. And even if it's I would imagine if it's a professional medical expert telling him, no, he always seems to be that way, where he thinks he's in the right.
Well, do you know what? He thought he was in the right when he was living on the streets, homeless, wearing 8 coats and with a beard and pissing himself, and you couldn't tell him. Paul knew best, so he was clearly a shell of a man he once was. But he still, and even though he wasn't scary in a physical aspect, he still was quick enough to tell you to F off, shut up, you know nothing, and I knew best.
Like that in the gym.
Yeah.
Like that in the gym.
So that part of him never mellowed. So I don't know, but you know what, Kevin, it's been an absolute real pleasure, sir. Thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
I'm gonna get this out on YouTube. Gonna put a thumbnail on, and we'll be in touch. We'll be in touch, Kevin. Thank you so much, sir. God bless.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. You're welcome.
Thanks a lot, sir. God bless.
You're welcome.